you. Next.
And we will have Ivahn Smadja from the University of Nantes. We will talk about Newton's conceptual and Euclid theory and the conceptual theory.
Well, first, I would like to warmly thank the organizers of this conference for bringing us together for this wonderful time here. It's really, really a great pleasure. So even if it's late in the day and we are all, perhaps it's all, we have to go back, we will go back to a history of mathematics. And in this talk, I will present some aspects of a joint work with Nicolas Michel, actually a work which is one of the byproducts of some archival research that I started long ago, probably too long ago, at the Chasles archive at the Paris Académie des Sciences. And it will hopefully touch upon some of the topics of interest in this conference, namely conceptual change and continuity of reference in mathematics. So it may be a transition between the talks of this morning and the previous talks and the late talk by David. And more specifically, I will tackle the problem of the continuity of methods and the relationship between ancient and modern geometry. So I hope that it work. Good, and then it's like this, okay. Among the 19th century French geometers, self-proclaimed followers of Monge, who contributed to promote the methods of pure geometry in contrast to analytical methods. Here you see Michel Chasles, who developed a characteristic research practice, because he constantly intertwined his pursuit of pure geometry with close historiographical scrutiny of past method. And this will be an example of the kind of research practice peculiar to him. He did so in his well-known Aperçu historique, but he continued thereafter with significant shifts and extensions with respect to his early views, although steering a clear and consistent course throughout his career. The way he connected his work on Euclid's lost Porisms and his new approach to the construction of curves offers an interesting case in point. So connecting an interest in ancient texts on the one hand, and a hot topic of mathematical research at the time in pure geometry, as we'll see. So, as you know, the Porisms, Euclid's Porisms, were a lost treatise of ancient Greek geometry, presumably attributed to Euclid, which we know only through Pappus and Proclus, who commented on it, however tersely. Chasles was not the first, or neither the only one, of course, to pay attention to Euclid's Porisms. Poncelet had stressed the importance of going back to these texts to get a better grasp of ancient methods, for this may help reviving pure geometry. So it was in the air at the time, but Chasles made it into an agenda of his own, because it turned out that making sense of Euclid's lost Porisms for him was deeply connected with his own contribution to geometry. And that's what I would like to present today, basing the work on archival material. Pondering this difference between ancient and modern geometry, Chasles relied on previous insights by Comte and Poncelet, Auguste Comte and Poncelet, which he deftly and fruitfully combined, but I leave this aside, it's dealt in print elsewhere. I will focus only today on recalling first that on the basis of his careful reading of Poncelet and Comte, Chasles crafted a new tool, both interpretive and constructive, by means of which he read in a new light Pappus's well-known lemmas on Euclid's lost Porisms, namely the so-called anharmonic ratio, as you know. Chasles read Pappus in Comandino's Latin translation and focused on a group of propositions, among which this one, the 129, to which was granted a pivotal role in Chasles' reading. With this standard configuration, you see 4 straight lines drawn from one point, an arbitrary transversal, 4 intersecting points, hence forming 4 segments, from which one forms a ratio, and this ratio is constant, whatever the transversal. So although perfectly aware that such rewriting ancient Greek lemmas in terms of this new tool, of this new notion, this anharmonic ratio, doing this would constrain our understanding of ancient mathematics into an alien format. Chasles was perfectly aware of that, but nevertheless, he considered his new tack justified and fruitful, as his later mathematical work showed. And this is what I would like to show. So in 1846, a chair of higher geometry was created for Chasles at the Faculté de Paris. And here you see the manuscript of a lecture course on conic sections held during his second teaching year, which bears witness of his working practice from the archive to the blackboard. Each year, he could choose a new topic and put to the test the fruitfulness of his new tools and methods. The wealth of methods, of material accumulated year in, year out, throughout this teaching experience was eventually gathered into a book published in 1852, Le Traité de Géométrie Supérieure. Therein, Chasles presented his new approach to geometry owing to new notational technology he had invented for the writing of geometrical proofs and propositions, a notational technology whose cornerstone, the so-called principle of signs, which was not in the aperçu, it's an innovation of the traité, whose cornerstone, the principle of signs, he also derived from historical work. How? The turning point is 1841. Then he substantially supplemented his first book, the Aperçu historique, with what may be called a material history of algebraic symbolism. that is a systematic scrutiny of all algebraically tinted treatises from Leonardo to the German Koss, whether in print or manuscript. He was chasing manuscripts all over Europe. And also, on the base of this historiographical work, antiquarial work, he added an in-depth analysis of that in which consisted the very influential strength of algebraic symbolism. So in short, as you know, the idea was to shift or to transfer the core of what made algebraic symbolism fruitful, inferentially fruitful, to pure geometry. And from this work on Viet, actually, and on all the treatises he read from Leonardo to, and all the Germans and so on and so forth, he drew the principles of science, which would allow him to transfer this epistemic strength from algebraic symbols to geometrical expressions. So, although seeming innocuous, you see this principle of science, which seems obvious to us, although seemingly innocuous, this notational innovation for writing segments opened the way to a new type of geometrical equations. These new geometrical equations, which he taught how to form, how to manipulate in his Traité de géométrie supérieure, these new geometrical equations, which are very peculiar, and which we propose to call the Chasles type equations, CTE, arise from two main sources. The first source consists in a pair of fundamental combinatorial relations, which themselves originate in the principle of science, namely this one, and a first one which derives immediately from the notational convention, and a second one which is slightly more complex and makes sense from the geometrical point of view, with this configuration in mind, in which four transversals intersect two straight lines and determine two series of corresponding points. In the one in red, for instance, a point is thrown at infinity so that the three others satisfy relation one. And then, now by bringing in the point at infinity and multiplying by ratios of segments, both involving the point at infinity, and reshuffling the equations, one obtained the relation two. So, which is in the last step is brought back to hold for any 4 points in a straight line. So this is the first source, two combinatorial relations between segments and points. And the second source is none other than the core fact that two corresponding series of 4 points in the configuration above have the same anharmonic ratio. Well, this is very well known, and what is interesting dealing with the drafts, the unpublished drafts of Chasles, is of course to go further than what is published in his treatise and in his articles, to see, so to speak, to open the door to the workshop and to see how he dealt with this kind of new notations and to do what. So the second source is, of course, the wealth of equalities between anharmonic ratios with corresponding series of points. Depending on the way you select the points, you have different types of equations. So you have a combinatorial spectrum of possibilities. And this is the two main sources from which he will construct his peculiar type of equations. All these relations stem from the second combinatorial relation above. Anyway, no need to get lost in these technicalities. The important fact is that Chasles uses these combinatorial expressions to derive geometrical equations for various geometrical loci. For instance, in the case of the straight line, as you know, two sheaves of rays are said to be homographic in corresponding rays if corresponding rays meet in points on a straight line. Here the black and the red ones. But conversely, one may define the straight line as a geometrical locus that is the intersection of two homographic rays. So the geometrical intuition is always the same. It's this simple fact, defining geometrical loci by the intersection of homographic sheaves. But this simple geometrical fact is susceptible or liable to be written in a variety of ways. And this is the, so to speak, the keyboard of his geometrical equations. And it's the relation between the geometric intuition, which is simple, and it's an intuition leading the way, and the wealth of expressions that allows him to solve difficult problems, as we will see. But the point is that Chasles found a way to pursue pure geometrical investigations while taking advantage of the inferential strength of his new notational technology. That is, that of geometrical equation of this specific type, the Chasles type equation. So there were many ways, for instance, to express the fact that two homographic rays intersecting for which a certain condition holds, generate a straight line. And these ways, which give rise to at least three kinds of equations, all of the straight line, namely the equation of two terms, of three terms, and four terms. So it's here an example where you see that the same locus, the straight line, is liable to be written to give rise to different equations, and depending on the inferential conjuncture, the inferential situation in which one stands, one chooses one equation over the other, and this is what Chasles does in his research, as we will see in a moment, to tackle difficult problems. So here you see the equation of two terms is, no need to go into the technicalities for the interest of time, I won't go into it, but you see it's very simple. The equation of two terms is an equation of the straight line, which derives from the first combinatorial relation above. The equation of three terms derives from the second, and the equation of four terms is a rewriting of the equation of four terms. So when you read the traité, you have the impression of, in French, of something tautological. You don't see, you have a wealth of expression, all equivalent, and you don't see the point of multiplying the equations of the straight line or the equations of conics and so on and so forth. So but you see the point of having all those equations when it comes to active research. So here, no need to get lost in the details. Let us keep in mind that with these equations, the Chasles type equations, one has a wealth of combinatorial expressions for one and the same geometrical fact, which is two homographic sheaves intersecting, and depending on the context and the expected inferential roots that are to be opened, one may choose the one or the other. One may arbitrate. So now let's see how Chasles used his equation to achieve the construction of what he presented himself as a difficult problem, namely the construction of the cubic curve. What is it? Construction of the cubic curve going through 9 points. So this is a feat Chasles accomplished in 1853. So what is the point? What is the problem? The problem is analogous to the well-known classical problem. You get given five points being given, construct the conic going through all 5 of them. So it goes at least, it goes back, it harks back at least to Newton, as you know, of course, and even earlier. But here the point is to extend this kind of method a step further to the cubic curve. The extension to cubics here requires 9 points. And Chasles observes that this problem has never been solved in purely geometrical way in the general case. Because here you see, you given 9 points, how to construct in a purely geometrical way the cubic going through all 9 points. Newton, as you know, obtained a partial solution of this problem with conditions imposed on the cubic, but not in the general case. So it's a titre de gloire of Chasles to show that his methods allow him to go substantially further than Newton here. So let's give an idea in a nutshell of Chasles' method. First, the problem is deemed difficult only when approached in a purely geometrical way. A blind algebraic solution would be trivial, merely amounting to solving a system of linear equations. And of course, there are plenty of more elegant and less tedious analytic methods in store. But the point is not here. Chasles wants a purely geometrical proof. What is at stake here may be understood following Chasles, who highlights Salmon's method. Salmon's method as a perfect form. How Salmon solves this problem? The problem is that whatever the mode of description, the difficulty, what's difficult about this problem, Chasles writes, is to introduce the 9 given points into the data serving to solve the problem. And how Salmon deals with this problem. In this way, starting with 9 given points, he takes the 6 first points, which he put into the equation. So here you see this equation is, you take the 6 first point from A to F. AB is the equation of the straight line going through A and B. So if you multiply the equation of straight lines, A going through AB, going through CD, going through EF, you end up with an equation which ensures you that you have a cubic and that it goes through at least the 6 first point. So the difficult part is how to introduce into the data the last 3 points. And Salmon does this. You impose that the curve goes through the last 3 points so that you can obtain the undetermined coefficients, the lambda mu nu here. So all 9 points are used in the construction of the cubic at one stage or another. So in a nutshell, Chasles' method is to do the same kind of move, but without relying on algebraic symbolism. That is, with his own notation, geometrical notation, with his own tool, own geometrical equations, that is in a purely geometrical way. And in this case, only the notational technology afforded by the Chasles type equations makes it possible to use the 9 points to determine what plays the role of the undetermined coefficients of his own system. But with this crucial difference, I'll go back, but with this crucial difference with Salmon, that the whole procedure now with Chasles is purely geometrical. And the Chasles type equations only provide a way to organize and steer the geometrical inference, the geometrical constructions. So how does it work? We don't go, of course, Chasles does this with his equations, but I will present the proof in picture, so to get more quickly to the point. How does this work? Among the 9 given points, the first 4, you take the first 4, they determine a sheaf of conics, of course. Then, for any point in the plane, there is a corresponding polar for each conic of the sheaf. Okay, so if you take an arbitrary point in the plane and you obtain for each conic a polar, hence a sheaf of rays. So you have a sheaf of conics and a sheaf of rays. Then for sorry. Yes, you have an infinity. I only drew 3, but you have an infinity, of course. Yes, if you have 5 points, you have 1 conic. So if you have 4, you have an infinity of conics. And so the next step is there. Chasles' innovation is just there. It's the idea that you have a sheaf of conics pulsating in the plane, and you have for each point a sheaf of rays. And if you move the point, the sheaf of rays also moves, but remains. All the sheaf of rays you obtain are homographic, so it doesn't depend on the position of the point. So now, on the basis of this, you can transport the sheaf of rays for instance, to the point P. And to do this, you have you need 3 more points to transport the sheaf of rays there. So one ends up with a sheaf of conics on the one hand and a sheaf of rays on the other hand. And one uses the last 2 points to determine the right point P, which completes the proof. And the idea is that the cubic curve you obtain is the locus of the intersection of each straight line, which is its corresponding conic. So this is the way, in a nutshell, the way Chasles proceeds. So, and in this way, the problem is solved. So, namely, with the right point P, each ray of the sheaf intersects the corresponding conic in 2 points, and Chasles shows that the locus of these pairs of points is the cubic curve one had to construct. And how does he do this? Owing to the CTEs and owing to the Chasles type equations, owing to the properties, the peculiar properties of his tool. So now, and I will speed up, present only the idea of how this problem, which is a hot topic of pure geometry at the time, which is non-trivial, is connected to Chasles' research in history of mathematics. And the point is that Chasles realized that his geometrical equations allowed him to solve the inverse problem. In 1855, you see, Chasles addressed here. This is the way the counterpart in terms of Chasles' equation, but we go through it, and I skip here to the inverse problem, which may help getting to the core of what I have to say. In 1855, Chasles addressed the inverse problem. That is how what used to be called the construction of the cubic equation. So now Chasles goes back to a very, very old problem, constructing the cubic equation in the sense of the construction of equations. This theory that was dead in the middle of the 19th century. So he reads it in this way, and he uses his notational tools. And the point is that now this equation encapsulates the same kind of geometrical information as previously, which suggests to bridge the two. So here Chasles developed a new method on the basis of his geometrical equations to revisit the tradition, so to speak. So here I don't have to go into the details of the drafts one finds at the Paris Archive, but they help us to see how he uses his equation to connect historiographical concern on the one hand and mathematical concern on the other hand. That means solving difficult problems. So I give a sketch of Chasles' construction of this construction of the cubic equation. You take you just take one series of segments on the one hand, and a series of points on the other hand, so that the segments and the points are connected by 2-1 correspondence. So by some sort of homographic relation. Then you take an arbitrary conic. You take an arbitrary point on the conic, and you draw the straight lines from this point to the extremities, the endpoints of the segments, and this determines chords. These chords lie on straight lines which all intersect in one point. So you have a sheaf of rays here, and from the point P, now you draw the lines from the point P to the points of the series of points. So you have two sheaves of rays, and those two sheaves of rays determine a conic here. And the solutions to the construction of the cubic equation is that you have two conics intersecting in 4 points. One of them is P, and the three others are the roots of the equations, and it's constructed in a purely geometrical way. So what's the point? From this, which is a purely byproduct of his mathematical method dealing with the difficult problem of constructing the cubic equations, it has results also on the historiographical side, because this leads Chasles to read, and I will finish with this, to go back to history and to try to explain why his method is better than the one that were in circulation since the 17th century. So I will skip this and only go to the main point, and the main point is that his method is uniform, because when you take the first conic arbitrarily and the second is determined, whether all the other proofs, you see, and in these drafts, what he does is using his own technology to reinterpret the famous problems of the tradition, the finding of two means proportional, the intersection of the angle. So trying to measure up to the tradition. So he wants to keep both threads in hand, the mathematical one and the historiographical one. And this leads him to go back to the British. So I skip this, to go back to the British and to try to go one step further, which he does. So in a nutshell, here the reference to the geometrical work of Newton and MacLaurin is central for Chasles. He read, for instance, the Arithmetical Universalis in the French translation by Baudeux, and endorsed Newton's main point, namely that it's not the equation but the description which produces a geometrical curve, hence that geometrical criteria of simplicity should prevail over algebraic ones, that is organic description of curves. So this is why he walks in Newton's footsteps, so to speak. And in this line of thought, he highlighted Newton's famous construction of the cubic equations by means of a Nusis construction. So to conclude, he went through all the British from Newton to MacLaurin and Simson. So since all this is well known, I will rush through it. So here, this is the, he provided an in-depth understanding of Newton's approach to the problem, the ad quatuor lineas, but using his own apparatus, of course. Then he tried to extend the method of organic description to cubics. And here, Chasles was very much interested in Newton's attempt. And as you know, Chasles had tried to extend the organic description of curves by means of rotating angles with suitable conditions on the describing legs and on the directing legs and the describing legs. But he made the best of a remark he found in MacLaurin, and I will skip this. And MacLaurin, this is MacLaurin, and in the papers of MacLaurin, which Chasles comments very carefully, you find the fact that MacLaurin found, this is what I use this title, A Spark of Understanding. MacLaurin explains that it's a remark by Simson working on Porisms, which put him on the way to opened the way to an extension of organic description beyond the conics to the cubics. And so this is as good as gold for Chasles. And this is in this way that reading the British, Chasles found a way to connect the invention of new notations promoting pure geometry on the one hand, so mathematical research on the one hand, and historiographical work on the other hand. How? And I will finish here. I will skip this. Reading and interpreting Simpsons is a kind of sport. Many people have worked on this, and Chasles is among them. But the interesting thing is not that Chasles pretends or claims to bring the truth about the right reading of Pappus's lemmas or Pappus's texts, but what is interesting to him is to find a way to connect ancient geometry to modern geometry. And so he does this, so I skip all the part on Simpson. And this is the end. He goes to the Porisms, and the Porism, his work on the Porism is an achievement, in a way. He read Euclid's Porism in the light of the CTEs, the Chasles type equation, and a couple of drafts from the Chasles archive will make this clear. The whole point of a Porism is that it makes possible to determine the values of the coefficients so that certain conditions be satisfied. Or more explicitly, in Chasles' view, Porisms were some sort of general formula to be applied to given cases. They were an equivalent of the method of undetermined coefficients. So you see the connection between what Chasles said about Salmon's method, how to do the equivalent, the same thing as the method of undetermined coefficients, but with purely geometrical means. So Chasles launched into an extensive reconstruction of Euclid's lost Porism, which he interpreted in terms of his geometric equations. And owing to the language of the CTEs, he could immediately grasp the meaning of the geometric configurations so as to determine the given taken in the sense of the constructible. So I won't go into the theory of Porisms here. I will only point to the fact that he tried to regain, and it's to a certain extent an artificial attempt. He tried to regain the variety of cases characteristic of Pappus's text of ancient geometry by specifying, by putting conditions on his geometrical equations so as to adjust them to what he took the Greeks to mean. So there's a great amount of artificiality in this reconstruction. This is not what is interesting in his attempt. What is interesting is this mixed combination, and this is the last word. This endeavor, Chasles' endeavor, elicited a variety of responses at the time, ranging from disbelief, here he was accused of pure archaeolatry, to reverence. And of course, de Jonquière was his student. So in conclusion, Chasles' research practice, intertwining the pursuit of geometry with close historiographical scrutiny of past method, connected ancient and modern geometry, offers an illustration of how elements of continuity and elements of discontinuity may be built into one another in an intricate way in the development of mathematical methods. So in a way, it may be some milk to grist for when one reflects on conceptual change and the continuity of reference. So I'm sorry, I was too long.
Thank you, Ivahn. The second period is out of time, which maybe we can have a quick question or remark.
How Chasles relates to method that Université Conceptual or Mozart?
Yes, he read Carnot.
In this kind of work, does it, or it is more historical?
His reading of Carnot, as well as his reading of Briançon, comes much earlier. When he does this, there is no more reference to this kind of work. At least to my knowledge, which is
strange because
yeah,
very general, it goes to a curve of degree.
yes, sure, sure, but what he does is framing of crafting this kind of notations, which in the details helps him find the climb, the way to find his way to solve his problems. I don't know how to.
So, thank you, Ivahn, again for your talk.
Event. It's so nice to see you again in vivo. I will come back to kind of a question of general methodology, the kind that we tackled this morning. So in fact, my talk will take place in the continuation of a discussion which started in the last Franco-Mexican seminar here in the last in Mexico in 2017. And as some of you may recall, Marina Imocrante gave a talk about the question of conceptual change in mathematics. And we started a discussion about the fact that the examples that she gave were of a particular type. Indeed, they concern cases when we are confronted to an extension of our mathematical knowledge, what we sometimes call domain extension. And although this case is already very difficult to describe, unfortunately for us, philosophers of mathematics, it's the easiest one. And what I had in mind was the kind of situation mentioned by Putnam in natural science, in which we have to deal with incompatible descriptions of the same object. So it's not an extension of the description of one object. We have two descriptions which are incompatible. Françoise Longy, who was there, said that she would be very interested to launch a working group on these issues because there is a rich literature on these questions in natural sciences, and in particular in biology, in connection with the problem of how we refer to natural kinds and in particular species, animal species. So this led to the creation of, how does it work? Okay. This led to the creation of what we call the Atelier Changement Conceptuel and Fixité de la Référence, which took place between 2017 and 2009, and you 19, and you have here a list, a partial list of all the people participating to this group, not all of them, and this was the launching text. So I won't read this, but you see that many people here participated to this group, and it was a consequence of the Franco-Mexican, a pure consequence. So we read a number of texts from Putnam, from Wilson, from Birch, from Epps. Epps was mentioned this morning, Brigand, Kitcher, and many others. And we realized that there was a form of consensus on the idea that we should dispose of a theory of reference which will hold a middle position between kind of Kuhnian incommensurability on the one hand and Putnamian externalism on the other hand. And here you have a quote by Brigant, a paper, famous paper on species, in which he wants to defend species pluralism, in which he says exactly that. I will not read it because, like Ivahn, I have too much material, but unlike Ivahn, I was supposed to talk in 2 days, so I hope I will have time to shorten it, but I will not. So what I will present to you today is my own rumination on this question, based on the work I was doing in parallel on Leibniz. In particular, I was struck by the fact that there is an interesting parallel between these modern debates, which are centered on language and reference, and the debate originating after Descartes on what was called at the time les vraies and les fausses idées. So there was a huge debate in 17th century, which ran in terms of ideas, and I claim that in fact it's the same debate. So it is a work in progress, and I will just formulate a few proposals. So it's not something which is finished at all. So let me start by quickly recalling the problem of the stability of reference as it is developed in the post-Quinian tradition by authors such as Kripke or Putnam, and so forth and so on. So here are a few references that we read, classical references on this question. There are many others. But as you may remember, the point of departure is various criticisms that were raised against what can be called the traditional view on reference. That is to say, the fact that we denote something when we dispose of a proper description of it. There are many ways to characterize what a proper description is. And I will not enter into the way that you define this, but I will stay content to gather them under the Cartesian motto of the clear and distinct. Okay, a proper description has to be clear and distinct. But if you are Fregean, this is what Frege called scharf begrenzt. It has to be sharply delimited. Okay, so it's a one criterion given by Frege and discussed in the literature. If you want a description to refer to something, it has to be delimited precisely. Okay. The Cartesian motto, as you all know, is that truth is reached through and only through clear and distinct ideas. Okay. The Fregean motto is that denotation, Bedeutung, is reached through and only through scharf begrenzt Sinn. It is not obvious that ideas can be equated with descriptions in Descartes, but it is the interpretation which was favored by many people, edifying a kind of Cartesian logic in 17th century, and in particular, Nicole and Arnaud in La Logique de Port-Royal. They describe what is in terms of ideas, they transfer it to a conception of judgment, which are sentences and so forth and so on. These, as it may, this point of view gained a new vitality to the Fregean idea that Sinn is a way to fix a Bedeutung. I don't translate this. An idea which was then expanded to the rational theory of definite description, which is just an extension of this idea. In this setting, it is very natural to consider that we grasp the Bedeutung of a notion when we dispose of a scharf begrenzt description of it, or sharply delimited, and this goes along with the idea that this description has to be complete. It has to be complete. By the same token, the conceptual change is seen primarily on the model of the completion of the extension. And so the first knowledge appears as a partial knowledge. And so there is a famous paper by Tyler Birch on this question in which he explained that this is the view that Frege held. And this is the starting point of the discussion with Marina Immoconte, because what I want to bring into the discussion is that it's a too easy case. Although it's very difficult to describe, we have many other cases than a domain extension. So Putnam's criticism was based on a situation which is at the same time more widespread and more dramatic. And this situation is the situation of incompatibility of description. So in this case, you will not describe it more completely. You will not describe it more precisely. You will change the description. And so one of the examples which is taken by Putnam in the two articles that I gave, I showed to you, very famous example is the various description of the electron. And as you all know, in the kind of Rutherford Bohr model, sometimes called the planetary model, electrons have a position on an orbit. And in the new model brought by Schrödinger, which is statistical and probabilistic in spirit, you don't have orbits, you have orbitals, and they don't have position anymore. You cannot ascribe position to electron. So this is a typical example, and you can find this everywhere. And Putnam starts from this, and it says, in this case, the problem is that you have two descriptions of what you want to say is the same object, but they are not compatible one with the other. There are some compatibility, but there are some points which are not compatible. Either the electron has a position or not. So before turning to how this can apply to mathematics, let me just stay a little bit in the realm of general history of science and emphasize that the problem was aggravated by the rapid development since Putnam of history of science developed at the micro level since the 1960s. I emphasize this fact because besides the model of completion, there is another tempting model, which is to relativize the theory of description to large framework, you know, like Kuhnian paradigms, Foucauldian episteme, whatever you choose, you know, this kind of huge methodology, large framework, and you say, okay, they are incompatible description, but they are related to huge framework of thinking. Style is another example, style of thinking in hacking. Okay, what is interesting in the example provided by Putnam is that they can occur at the micro level of the rapid development of knowledge. So here Putnam took only two examples on the electrons, but there are many theories of the electrons in that year, starting from the end of the 19th century, and they change every 10 years, and they are incompatible one with the other. One is like a soup, the other is like the orbits, and so forth and so on. And not only that, but in this problem, one and the same actor can have incompatible description. Bohr is a typical example. Bohr is precisely on both sides. Okay, so it's not a problem of controversies. It's a much more simple problem that we can change our mind. We can change our description, and even in the lifetime of one and a single actor. Okay, so when you talk, and of course, this is the kind of stuff which are very familiar to historians. In fact, the recourse to a large framework of meaning presupposes to solve another problem, which can be framed in terms of the articulation between the local level of description and the global level of description in the history of science, or if you want, the micro and the macro level. And so if you enter into this question, but I will, oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you what was Putnam's solution, but we talked about it this morning. So Putnam's solution to the problem is what is called semantic externalism. That is to say that we interact causally either with a specimen or with experts, and these experts, they transmit some meanings through history. So you have here is the example of electricity. Anyway, so that was a flashback. I come back to the problem of micro and macro level. So here is a typical way to put the problem in with these two questions in line in one of Jan Hacking's paper, in which he says that we need today, this is a challenge for us, all of us, historians and users of science, to reconcile 3 points of view. One is the macro level, so this is the micro-social interactions, so the A. The second one is current philosophical conception of truth being logic, meaning, and knowledge, and here he means Putnam. You will see in the next slide. And C is like the huge cumulative aspect of science, you know, this global aspect of science, the kind of thing that we saw, the kind of huge continuity that we can find in science. And we need to reconcile these three things. And Hacking says that this is one of the philosophical tasks in our times. And here he put some names. I will not read them. So a typical thing that we have to. So in fact, conceptual change is just one way to frame the problem of incompatibility of description, which occurs more generally each time we find a disagreement or even a divergence of interpretation, and this occurs all the time, everywhere, without ceasing. So it's way more problematic than Kuhnian incommensurability. It's like generalized incommensurability. we have incompatible descriptions everywhere, and we have to understand how it works. How can people denote things, and how they can have a cumulative knowledge in this one. So one author who put some emphasis on this is Kitcher in his book from 1993, which is called The Advancements of Science, in which he tries to demythologize science, and he insists on the fact that we have this huge proliferation of micro change. Okay. Unfortunately, this problem did not reach much the philosophy of mathematics with the same strength that it hit the philosophy of natural sciences. And most of the times, authors tackle this issue only from the point of view of the extension of mathematical knowledge. It is all the more intriguing that the difficulty is more vivid in mathematics than any other realm of knowledge for obvious reasons that I will just recall. So the first, so I call this the hard case of mathematics. And I don't talk about this from the point of view of philosophy of math. I talk about this from the point of view of general philosophy of science. If you want to have a general philosophy of what denoting is in science, you need to include math at some point, or to tell us what's happening in math. And in math, it's much more complicated to solve the problem. First, of course, mathematics is very much cumulative. We saw a beautiful example in Ivahn Smadja, but there are many other examples. Second, there is an ultimate judge of controversy. This is an expression from Leibniz, which is proof, proof, and proof. So of course, the criteria of proof change, but at least there is one criterion. If there is a proof, there is a proof, and either it's valid or it's invalid. It can change, but there is a criterion. But still, there are strong disagreements in mathematics, and all the history of science, this microhistory starting in the 60s, show this everywhere. And it was maybe less well known to people before, but we cannot use Puntan solution for two obvious reasons. First of all, there is no causal interaction with object in mathematics, I'm sorry. Except if you're a hard Platonician in the Gödelian way, you think that we perceive of the mathematical object with something, but if you don't buy this, there is no causal interaction. So there is no causal interaction with specimen. And second thing, which is very important in mathematics, and Ariles asked this question this morning to Camille, we have in mathematics comparable development in disconnected regions of time and space. And this is something which is very striking. So it can be different cultural eras, but it can be social communities discovering the same thing at the same time. So I had some example about cumulative classical. You read one proposition from a Euclid and you say, okay, I recognize this proof and I accept it. Okay, but I will not enter into this for a reason of time. Classical, so I chose only very basic simple example so that it talks to everybody, not only the mathematician in the room, okay? So basic example, the arithmetical triangle, which is to be found in China with no connection to Europe, no connection at all, and it's the same. I mean, just look at it, it's the same. In the middle, it's just the translation of what is in the Chinese, just a translation. And here is Pascal version of it, which is one amongst many others. There is one in the Arabic authors, there is one in Stiefel, and we don't have connection yet between all of this. So we have a very difficult situation in mathematics if we want to have a proper theory of reference, because we have the initial problem put by Putnam of incompatible description, increased by the fact that mathematics is very cumulative. As this phenomena of disconnected discoveries in which you cannot use the causal theory of transmission, because we historians do not have any document of transmission in many cases. Okay, so before turning to some ways of solution, let me give you some simple examples to what I alluded to by saying that we have disagreement in mathematics everywhere, but not only disagreement, misunderstanding, change of opinion, not only controversies. Controversy is just a special case of what Putnam is describing. We just change description, or we disagree on description. So I prepared some examples. So this one I like very much. It's the discussion between Claude Chevalet and Oskar Zariski. And at some point, Chevalet so they were very famous algebraic geometer, and they were friends. They are not enemies, no controversy involved in this, although they have different styles of doing mathematics. And at some point, Chevalet, I think, says to Chalesky, but what is a curve for you? And I like this example because it's a very basic object. I mean, he's not saying what is a higher homotopy group. He's saying, what is a curve? I don't understand. And so Dariski goes to the blackboard and he draws this. And Chevalet says, are you crazy? A curve is this. So the missing parenthesis is in the original. It's not a typo. I mean, it's a typo, but not from me. And if you are not familiar with this, the difference, because you could say, okay, these are just two ways to express curves, but there are profound differences between these two ways. And you can see this with the example that Ivahn was talking about with conics, because if you think that a curve is something which is a continuous something, okay, it will be the kind of conics that Ivahn draws, but Ivahn has other conics that he did not show to you, which are degenerate conics. And the question is, do you accept that a point is a conic? So if you have the polynomial expression, you have it for free, okay? You have the generated conics, which are included in your definition of curves, or do you accept that two straight lines is a curve, okay? What we call degenerate conics. So there is a strong question behind this point of view. And I like this example because it's a very simple one by two very important mathematicians. And you see that, in fact, they simply don't understand each other, although they are practicing mathematics, having proof, and agreeing on many other things. So another example, I don't know why there was this problem, but that I love, because it's my corpus. It's this quote from Leibniz. So once again, it's between friends. So Leibniz, it's at the end of his life, he recalls this story. When our friends were disputing in France with the Abbé Gallois, Father Goose, and others, I told them that I did not believe at all that there were actually infinite or actually infinitely small quantity. The latter, like the imaginary roots of algebra, were only fiction, which, however, could be used for the sake of brevity and in order to speak universally. But as the Marquis de l'Hôpital thought that by this I should betray the cause, because these people are not, I mean, he's talking with his friends, L'Hôpital, Bernoulli, who are fighting for the differential calculus at the Académie des Sciences. And they go to Leibniz and says, please help us with the cause. And Leibniz says, you know what? There is no infinitely small. And so, but as the Marquis de l'Hôpital thought that by this I should betray the cause, they asked me to say nothing about it, except what I already had said in the Leibniz Acta. And in French, he says, and il me fut aisé de déférer à leur prière. So this is a typical example. I mean, all of these people are early practitioners of Leibnizian differential calculus. They all agree on the practice, no problem at all, but they disagree on one of the basic concepts. What denotes dx, dy? Do we have that? So it's example. So examples are like that. We have many of them. I mentioned this one, very famous, Teva, at the beginning of the arithmetic, saying that people did not understand what a number is because they excluded the unity and the zero. And you have this beautiful passage, very poetic, in which he says, but I will not have time to read it, but he says, oh, heure infortunée, where people say that one was not a number, because when they started to, and there was the principle of number, because when they did that, they broke the parallel between magnitude and number, which is what appears in Euclid, okay? And so it's a typical example of strong disagreement. I mean, they don't have the same. We have many examples like that. I will quote some others. So this one I like very much. It's in the beginning of set theory in France. So there was a strong group defending set theory in France around Baire, Borel, Lebesgue. But in fact, they disagreed with Cantor on some very specific points because they were what we call semi-intuitionist. And it's very interesting. So I just gave you a reference on this issue. And there is this beautiful quote by Baire, in which Baire is asked, since he was a strong supporter of set theory, is asked to write the article on set theory in one encyclopedia. And then he realized what Cantor is doing with these ordinals and this scale of ordinals, transinfinite ordinals. And so I will not have time to read it, but he says, oh, that's awful because I'm obliged to develop this theory that I'm a supporter, but I don't see any use of this. Pas la moindre application, and je ne vais tout de même pas en inventer. Okay? So it's a typical example of a disagreement of people working. I mean, all of these people are using set theory, but they disagree on very important elements. So this is another example, which is, so this one is accessible to everybody. I chose example that you can read the paper. They are not difficult papers. So this one is online by our colleague Caroline Erhardt. Very simple example, the notion of group, which was invented by Galois. When you read Galois, what Galois calls group is not what we call group. I will not enter into the details. And of course, this raises problem of interpretation. And the first follower of Galois had different interpretation. And so she explained this in this paper. And in fact, the title originated in the discussion that we had about Leibniz. So Leibniz called notion something and ID something else. And in fact, so she said that there is one idea of the group, but three notions. Okay, so she said concept, but that's not her thing. And so she explained that Cayley has a version of the group, which by tables, and Dedekind has what we call abstract groups, and it's really different practices, and then they will merge. So it's a typical example in which we have a divergence of interpretation, and then they will merge, but at some point they coexist like this, and we don't know if they are compatible when they appear. At least the actors don't see them as being the same thing. Okay, now we know that they are. Another very nice example, I chose example from our colleagues, young colleagues, or not so young now, from History of Math, is from Frédéric Brechenmacher, very accessible paper online about matrices. And he did something very nice. He took a handbook, a modern handbook on matrices, and he put a system of color and then he explained where it comes from different threads in the history. Okay. 5 minutes, it's a catastrophe. Okay, so let's forget about the example. No, so I said that I wanted to try to propose a solution inspired by Leibniz, but I don't know if I will have time. So I will a quick summary of an idea that Leibniz developed in response to the querelle des vrais et des fausses idées. So you have the reference. So the first idea that Leibniz wants to emphasize is that this discussion is not clear among the Cartesians because we don't know what a clear and distinct idea is. So he says, let's give some criteria, and he gives them. And so he has a nice tree, which he says a notion can be obscure or clear. Inside of clear, it can be confused or be distinct. It can be inadequate or adequate. And then he jumps. And he says, or likewise, it can be symbolic or intuitive. Okay, I will comment about this. And then he says, okay, the most perfect thing is when you are on the right, clear, distinct, adequate, and intuitive. And then he explains what he has in mind, and this is very interesting. So he says that a notion is distinct when you can give a list. A notion is clear when you can recognize what you're talking about, okay? But it doesn't mean that it's distinct because you can recognize love, but maybe not give a definition. And when you can give a list of marks, okay, this idea is clear and distinct, okay? When you give a list of marks, what you give is a nominal definition. The problem is that you're not sure that all of your marks are themselves clear and distinct. If so this is what he explains here. And then if everything which enter into your mark is clear and distinct, then you have reached perfect knowledge, which is adequate, okay? And look at the conclusion. Whether man can offer a perfect example of this, I do not know. Yet the knowledge of numbers comes very close to it. He never said that the knowledge of number is an example of adequate knowledge, contrary to what Frege claimed. But then in the vast majority of cases, we don't have this list of marks which is clear and distinct. And we have what he calls blind knowledge or symbolic knowledge. Symbolic knowledge, please, has nothing to do with the use of symbols in your sense, although it includes it. Okay, symbolic knowledge, if you use words, it's symbolic knowledge in the same way. Typical example that I like, the regular decaedron, an example which is given. So everybody understands what a regular decaedron, deca 10, hedron faces, regular means identical faces. You have a drawing here. Here is a paper in physics about the C1 is a regular decaedron, is the shape of nanoparticle of gold. I underline regular decaedron. Here is an example in the handbook of math, but any mathematician in the room knows that there is no regular decahedron because there are only 5 regular convex polyhedra, as was demonstrated by Euclid already, not convincingly, but anyway, it was true. So it's a typical example of blind knowledge. I talk about an object. There are papers about this object. We can define this object, okay? But this is a kind of misunderstanding. We did not analyze it very carefully. And I skipped something under the carpet, but as you saw, it seems that some physicists do the same. Physicists for physics, yeah. So now is the solution. So this is where I wanted to arrive. This is the solution. So basically, we use blind knowledge everywhere. That's the idea. How do we denote things, or do we refer to things? So there are 3 solutions proposed by Leibniz. I will not read it, but you have to. You will read it, okay? And so the first solution is you analyze the concept and you try to reach the last element, okay? Maybe you will succeed. The second solution is genetic description. You describe a way to engender, to produce your object, okay? And the third strategy is experience, okay? And once again, he says perfect analysis, that is to say the first case in which you can go until the end is something that never arrives. It's almost impossible. So you have, so to sum up Leibniz's position, the vast majority of what we know is performed in a context of epistemic opacity. And that, I think, is very interesting. I think it's very interesting, compared to our first debate. Also, what he calls cognitivo-caica. We have no example of perfect analysis. We have no example of fully adequate notion. We have some things which resemble it, okay? We need to supply blind knowledge with various strategies in order to guarantee the possibility or the truth of our knowledge. That is to say, it's referential import. We need to have a strategy to show that it denotes something. And there are 3 strategies: conceptual analysis, most of the time imperfect, genetic construction of object, experience. And the first thing I find very interesting, that it's a pluralist solution to our problem. Instead of saying there is one solution to the problem of reference, is saying there are different strategies. And in fact, it's only 3, maybe there are 4, 5, 6, but at least we have these 3. And then what I wanted to do is show to you an example that we can do it, even in our case in mathematics, but I will not have time. So maybe I will just go very quickly about this. So first of all, there is something very interesting in defense of conceptual analysis against Putnam. And that was done by Kitcher. Kitcher did that very beautifully in some paper about the question of theoretical change. He took the example of the phlogisticon, and he says, as soon as you do the conceptual analysis and you see that, in fact, they are referring to different things, one that does not exist and one that exists, and you see that they don't, in fact, it's separate context, then you can go back to the situation and have a process of disambiguation and say, in this case, they were talking about oxygen. And in this case, they were talking about this entity that they created under the name phlogisticon. And it's very simple. And in fact, Bark-Wilson has same kind of idea in this paper, predicate meets property, and it works with a lot of mathematical objects. So curves, continuity, functions are objects in which you can analyze retrospectively by disambiguating. So it's true that function for us is not the same that, this is what Jean did. Function for us is not the same that function for Leibniz, but it's very easy to disambiguate. You do the conceptual analysis and you can explain why it's not the same thing. And in fact, it's just a case of ambiguity of a word. So it's not a problem of reference at all. So it's very simple and we should use this. Genetic description of objects is something that we should also consider. And I wanted to explain to you why we can use this to solve the problem of Stephan and Euclid, because in that case, you cannot, it's not a problem of ambiguity. Really, they disagree. They don't have the same, there's no way. But in fact, they agree on something, which is the way to manipulate numbers and basically the use of GCD and LCM, which is crucial for Stephan. And in fact, what defines what a number is. And in fact, it's an extension in that case of the notion of a Euclidean number, which is exactly what we call Euclidean domain today. So that's very interesting because here we don't care if people agree on the definition. We want them to agree on the procedure with which they construct their object. Okay. And it's the same, well, okay, I could have shown to you this because he transferred the Euclidean algorithm to polynomials. It's not important. It's exactly the strategy that Leibniz is proposing for fiction. In fact, Leibniz is saying, we don't care if you believe or not in infinitesimals. As soon as we practice the calculation, we produce the result in the same way. So it's a procedural solution, okay? And it's not important because it works in both ways, okay, in both interpretation. So that's the second. But what about experience? So at first, when you think, well, if you project your basic idea about Leibniz, you said there is no place for experience in mathematics. But in fact, Leibniz talks about this a lot. And he thinks that there is a huge place for a posteriori in mathematics. Not only that, he thinks that this is the privilege of mathematics. He thinks that in mathematics, there here a posteriori is a much more secure way than in other sciences. So I will not have to develop this, just believe me. And why? Because in mathematics, we work with material representation on which we can test our results. And these experiments are in total control, contrary to experiments in physics and in biology. This is what Leibniz explained, okay? And this is a beautiful quote from the Nouveaux Essais, I read it. Ce qui a fait qu'il a été plus aisé de raisonner démonstrativement en mathématiques, c'est en bonne partie parce que l'expérience peut y garantir le raisonnement à tout moment, comme il arrive aussi dans les figures du syllogisme, which for Leibniz are something that you can test. Mais dans la métaphysique et dans la morale, ce parallélisme des raisons et des expériences, I like this, ne se trouve plus. Okay, so this is something that I have tried to develop in other papers. I will not explain this. Okay, I will stop here. I talk too much. I think you have an aperçu, as shall we say, about the kind of proposal that we can make to solve the problem of reference. And I think that what's important is to have kind of pluralist approach to the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for one question, maybe two questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm not sure I can phrase my question properly. Such a short time, you said a lot I had to think about. But I was particularly interested in the example of the regular decahedron, because it made me think about what's at stake. The possibility of having definitions of things that don't exist. And for some reason that seems different to me than the other cases you mentioned about incompatibility. Because I can think of many things I can define that don't exist. And they seem to be sort of like false examples of what you're trying to say. And I'm not sure if that's accurate or if I missed something and they are actually all sort of examples of the same thing. I don't know if you could say.
No, I see what you mean. So I took this example, which is very particular because it's an impossible object, to get a feel of what is blind knowledge. So the blind knowledge is that you have the impression that you have an object. But in fact, with further analysis, you see that you don't have it. So it's not any kind of impossible object. And I think it's very interesting because, as you see, there are some papers nowadays. There are some examples in mathematics and books in which they mention regular decahedron. And we know it's not very important. We know it's not very important. It's not very important to tell them, you know, there is no regular decahedron, because in fact, it's just a problem of conceptual analysis in which we can sharpen the definition and says, no, in fact, what you call a regular decahedron doesn't enter into the normal definition of what is a regular polyhedron. So it's very easy. So you're right. It's a very particular example of impossible object, but I took it just because I think it's let's take other, this example, it's another places. He loved the example with infinite object, infinitary object. But in that case, you have the impression that the impossibility stems from the infinity. And I wanted to show that, no, you have very simple example in which you have the impression of that. And not only that, it's much more complex that the fact that it's totally impossible. You see what I mean? I mean, we can try to change the characterization so that it's a possible object. In fact, we do that all the time. So that's what I find interesting.
Thank you.
Maybe we can have another quick question.
I think Scott had a question.
Thank you, David, for a wonderful talk. I want to go back to 2 points you made. First, you arguing that mathematics, we don't have objectivity in a mathematical history sense, and then you invoked at the same time hacking, and at the end, I like this, where that you have the objectivity here for hacking, as it's called, in the style of scientific reasoning. First style of scientific reasoning is the mathematical style.
No.
So the idea, so I'm just kind of confused about what you mean by objectivity here.
Okay.
Because certainly we have objectivity in that sense in mathematics and also in the experimental sciences. And
Okay.
so, yeah, even beyond Platonism.
No. Okay, that I can explain very easily. So in fact, I did not use the word objectivity. And no, that's true, I did not use it. And in fact, there are 2 types of Platonism: Platonism of object and Platonism of objectivity. Leibniz is a Platonist of objectivity, of truth. So you have mathematical truth, which are stable and which are in God's mind. The question whether or not you have mathematical object is a complex question which is debated among scholars. So there are 2 completely different issues. And I wrote a paper that I will send you, but the fact that you can be fictionalist and Platonist at the same time in Leibniz meaning. For hacking, it's completely different. Hacking style of mathematical reasoning is crazy because, no, yes, this is the weakness of his description because he doesn't know anything about mathematics. So there, for hacking, there is one style in mathematics which goes from the Greek to today, which is the axiomatic style. Then he presented this in a few conferences, and of course, our good friend Karin Schemla says, wait a minute. So maybe we exist, we Chinese and all of this, but not only that, I mean, algorithmic style. So he included the algorithmic style in second set, but no more, which is really crazy. I mean, he should have many styles in mathematics in the same sense that he has many styles in natural sciences. And this is exactly what Chevalet was claiming in this talk. And I wanted to finish with this. It's a beautiful paper in which you can see that Poincaré is using the epsilon style, although he disagrees with Weierstrass on everything, but he uses it because it's a style of writing, because the notation allows you to do things, you see. And so, but anyway, so it's strange what hacking has to say about objectivity in general and even in style, because he wants to correlate this. And for mathematics, it turns to be trivial. You have only one style and one type of objectivity, which is axiomatic style. I mean, it's.
I think he wants to found all mathematics on false mathematics. He wants to parts.
Yeah.
He certainly doesn't want to go into anything.
Yeah, okay, but that doesn't change much about the problem that you have many, in my sense, you have many styles in mathematics, and do they or not have different types of objectivity? According to hacking, they should. So the epsilon style is a typical style which is contrasted with algebraic analysis. Does it mean for hacking that you have 2 types of mathematical objectivity or not? It doesn't talk about this. There is a Spanish author who wrote a book on mathematical style, claiming, and he gave the style of the indivisible, the style, and he has this idea that you have various type of objects and objectivity. His name will come back later. Yeah.
So we will finish with this question. If you have time. Thank you again.
Yeah.